Hey, my name is Jason Banks, and this is my submitting of AEP855 Mod 14, the case study. So, really quickly, case summary. We have Richard, who's an assistant principal, found himself in a situation that has multiple ethical dimensions. Richard called James, a student who's been a problem, but somebody he's worked with, into his office because he'd been tardy for a third time. And it was later reported to Richard, the assistant principal, that a teacher saw James hand something, which might possibly be drugs, to David, a student who is unknown relatively to Richard. So Richard asked the school resource officer to retrieve David from class, bring him to his office, and with both students in his office, Richard begins to investigate the situation. So James admits to handing something to David, and when David is asked about this exchange, he is visibly upset, doesn't respond, which prompts the SRO to search his person, in which case he finds a set of brass knuckles. So this causes the officer to handcuff David for the felony possession of an illicit weapon. Who begins to cry? David. He begins to cry, at which point James admits that he had threatened David with physical harm if David didn't hold on to the weapon on his way to the office. Upon hearing this, Richard asks why the cuffs weren't coming off, and the officer responded that, according to the law, both students would be taken into jail and charged with a felony. So, additionally, in spite of James admitting that the weapon was his, both students are going to be expelled for at least 45 days, and they're going to be placed in an alternative setting. So, Richard begins to feel remorse over his decision to involve the officer, which is, of course, a result of hindsight, as he did not know the coercion that took place. And then we hit our ethical dilemma where he can't quite decide whether to fill out the expulsion paperwork on David, and in fact turns out to not do so. So our legal and ethical issues are such that there are protections against illegal searches and seizures in school, but the Supreme Court found in New Jersey versus TLO that if there is reasonable suspicion, that there can be an easing of that Fourth Amendment. Second, in the state of Kansas, there is a legal expectation that students who are found with weapons should be expelled for the possession of that weapon. And third, again, in the state of Kansas, although there is no state named in this one, that students who have been expelled are entitled to a hearing, and that they should be given counsel or allowed to have counsel to and call witnesses in that hearing. Ethical issues are that James, of course, made an ethical situation happen when he harmed David by including him in this whole situation. Richard is slightly ethically on the hook for bringing the police officer into it. And then there's the final issue of Richard's ethical decision making. Of course, he is morally conflicted. He doesn't want to do the wrong thing, and so he thinks he shouldn't fill out the paperwork, and it winds up making things a bit more sticky than they should be. So a synthesis, and the issue here is that while Richard regrets his decision, specifically that to allow the officer to be a part of the investigation, the ultimate decision is out of his hands, as David, while perhaps unintentionally, has broken the law, and while there may be mitigating factors, as there are laws in place, it is no longer in Richard's purview. So the people involved are Richard Inman, assistant principal, Rocket Junior High; James, kind of a hard-nosed, rough around the edges kid who's been making some strides lately. There's David Ramos. He's 13. He's like an honor student. He plays in the band. Presents himself as maybe a bit of an easy target. There's the police officer, who, again, his power comes from the fact that he's in the position of law enforcement. James' mother, she seems to be less than engaged in what happens to James. David's mother, different story, inverse of that. She's very much engaged. And then finally, this unnamed director of secondary education, who is in the end attempting to sort of model this ethical conduct for Richard about what to do with the paperwork on David. Place, Rocket Junior High, population of 900, seems to be an urban community, and that one that has a very distinct set of socioeconomic boundaries. The program seems like a normal public middle school. Doesn't seem to be anything too different about it. If we review the information, there is harm. There's potential harm for both James and David, the Ramos family as well. Their reputations could be harmed. And even though James might be familiar, the continuation of the stereotype against him could perpetuate harm, as well as the fact that there's data that shows that suspensions and expulsions lead towards a depression of the graduation rate. Um, Richard may see himself some harm if he's not careful, because it could if he doesn't do this right, he could see a diminution of his career and reputation. And then finally, if it's not handled right, the entire culture of the school could be harmed. Um, because of it, we need to engage all the stakeholders. And as a school leader, Richard should be aware of all the laws, but it seems like in this case, he might have some places that he needs to build his understanding. And while it's true that James took credit for the weapon, what we need to know, what we don't know in this case, is whether David was being honest in what happened, whether James was being honest, whether James was just taking the credit for something in order to protect somebody who might not know the system that well. He's trying to keep, because James is familiar with the system, he might be trying to keep him away from it. We just don't know, so we probably need some more information on that. But with that in mind, we have a few options. And option one is basically what Richard did at the first, just not fill out the expulsion paperwork. The consequences of this are, failure to do so will result in an official reprimand for Richard. There could be among the students, especially from the same neighborhood as James, a perception of favoritism that could damage the culture of the school. And then there's also the potential to lose staff support, who may see the decisions as ethically questionable and legally dubious. One thing that's not there is that also there may be this issue where the harm may come, the consequence may be that David is initially shielded from consequences, but then later becomes a target of those consequences, which may feel out of whack because there's been a great deal of time that's passed. Option two, which is on the other side of this, is to turn in the paperwork and then absolutely fully advocate for David's innocence. And those mean that you're going to have to put pressure on James to admit in court, in front of the board, which he may not likely want to do. And this could lead to a loss in the relationship between Richard and James, which Richard has worked so hard for. Again, there's another chance to lose the support of some staff who may see David as an innocent victim, and you're putting him in the system, and people may see that as unfairly punishing him. There's another chance that students may not see the complexity of the situation, much like the staff above, and instead focus on the injustice of punishing a student who they see as innocent, right? And that may lead to damage to the school climate as well. And then there's the potential to lose the moral high ground due to the potential imbalance of effort, right? If you're seen as putting all of your ducks into David's basket and none of them into James, people may see that you're playing favorites there. Option three is a kind of a combination of the two, where you don't turn in the paperwork and then try to fight the system. Of course, this is going to result in official reprimands for Richard. You're going to probably not change the legal boundaries, and so you're going to be losing your labor, and then all the staff is just going to see you as tilting at windmills and probably lose confidence in you. And finally, option four is to turn in the paperwork, allow the system to function on its own, but provide all the stakeholders with the relevant information, what they need in order to deal with the situation. And then, of course, also within this option is to support both students upon the return to school. So consequences are that David may wind up being punished for something he shouldn't. Right? It still may wind up that he's found culpable for this. But there also again could be a loss of faith by the community that you allow a student to be punished who was seen as heading for success, and then there may be some questionable ethical boundaries there that you may wind up still damaging the school climate. So each option has its shortcomings, right? In one, you're basically breaking your ethical boundaries, and you're not doing what is right. You're going against the law, and that's wrong. Option two, it just seems too far, right? It doesn't seem like it's balanced. You're putting all your work into one student and sort of forgetting about the other. Option three, it's probably the most problematic. Not as I'm going to expose Richard to censure, but it's going to have no effect on David's outcome, right? By the time that the legal system has changed, all of the negative impacts will have already happened to David, and the restitution will come far too late. So option four seems like the best one, right? There's still potential harm. There's still things that could happen, but getting everybody involved, getting as much information to people seems like that will be the best choice. So how are we going to implement this? So we're going to take these steps in order to maintain ethical conduct, and the school leader is going to have to, at the same time, advocate for these ethical and legal decisions. So the first thing he's going to have to do is he's going to have to fill out the appropriate paperwork on David. There's just no way around it. It's the law. He has to do it. But once he's done that, he's going to have to, in order to make things as ethical as possible, he's going to have to phone the district office and let them know that he's going to file the paperwork that he's filled out. He has intention to fill it out after communicating with the family, right? And then once he's done so, he's going to have to gather all the relevant information to this situation, like what the law says, what rights the family has, what what steps, the family should take. And then once he has those things all gathered, then he's going to have to contact David's mother. And this is, again, before he's turned in the paperwork, to inform her that the things have changed. And this is where it's really ethically problematic because of his previous decision. But in order to make things right, he's going to have to do this. He's going to have to contact her, let her know that things have changed, but he's also going to have to lay out that information that he gathered in step 3. Once he's done that, he's going to need to gather all the stakeholders, including the director of secondary education, because this is, the person who's sort of the end all here, and they're going to have to bring them all together so that they can let David know what's going to happen. And then once that's happened, they're going to have to provide that information that happened in step 3 again, and then after that, submit the paperwork. So after he's done that, one of the important things that he's going to have to do is he's going to have to sort of cultivate the ethical behaviors of others by making contact with James, right? James admitted to what he did in the meeting. That's great and all, but he's going to have to, Richard was proud of him. It was a big step for him, but he's also going to have to help him do that right thing of admitting to these facts at any hearings that might happen, right? Letting him know that he still has the support of the school, he still has the support of Richard, right? And that he made a mistake and he still wants to see him succeed. And then finally, Richard is going to have to attend any hearings for David and advocate for what is right in the situation, right? Which it seems would be that David should not feel the full consequences that James does. So, there's a real chance that David may still face expulsion. And while this isn't likely, it must be considered. So that means that we're going to have to continue to demonstrate to both David and his family that while it's unfortunate, it's a bad decision of a middle school student, it's not going to be used to define who he is, and we're going to have to really help David reintegrate into the system, because he may feel let down by the system, he may feel let down by us, but if we work to foster that relationship again, I think we can make some inroads there. So this was my look at the case study for AEP 855, and have a good night.